Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a few moments, giving folks a minute to jump on. Thank you for being here today. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to get on, and we will get started in 3 or 4 minutes. Good time to grab some water, get your blanket, cozy up, and we're going to get started with our conversation shortly. I will annoyingly say this multiple times until we start because people keep joining. So thank you for being here. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We will get started in just a couple of minutes. We're giving folks a minute to jump in. Good time to grab water, get ready, and we will get started in a few minutes. Thanks for being here. I always feel like I need a dance track during this time we're waiting for folks to join. Welcome, everyone. We're going to start in a couple minutes, but I always like, hello. If I could sing for you, I would. Marion, our director of content, who's on this call, is actually a very good singer. So at some point we may need to dispatch them to come on and regale us with song.
We also need more tech organizing songs. Like this
Absolutely.
is a gap right now.
Can we do a modern Solidarity Forever by Marion?
We'll make it techno to really drive home the tech part of it.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. We're just giving folks a chance to get in. Folks are still rolling into the webinar. Thank you for being here today. We'll get started with our event at 12:05 in just a minute. I appreciate the support for dance music in the chat. I'm going to work on that. All right, it's 12:05. Let's go ahead and get started. So thank you, everyone, for joining today. Our event, Tech and Labor Unions. My name is Samantha Gordon, and I am Tech Equity's SVP for Organizing and Advocacy. And I'm really excited to have this conversation today and really honored to be joined by two fabulous guests. Before we get into introducing them and into our discussion, I wanted to give an overview of who we are and what we do at Tech Equity for anyone new here. So at Tech Equity, we organize tech workers to take action on building an economy where everyone can benefit from the growth that tech has created. So we do that in really three primary ways. One is we educate tech workers with events like these. Two is we run a policy advocacy agenda. We work to get policies passed and implemented that we think will create the structural change that's really required to make it possible for people to benefit from the growth that tech has created. And third is we connect tech workers to the community around them. Our two areas we focus on are housing and labor. So obviously today is really focused on the labor side of the coin. We've done a couple events already this year. If you're interested in those topics and want to explore more, there's a lot of information on our website, and in the resources tab on our website, you can see all of our past events if you want to check those out. And I want to just thank all of you for being here today. We love being able to do these events. We miss doing them in person and seeing your face live and, you know, when we could be people in the world. But if you love them too, or you just appreciate that an organization like Tech Equity exists, I would encourage you to become a member. You can become a member by contributing $10 a month or $100 a year to ensure that we can continue to do programming like this and continue to fight for policy change that's needed. Our community manager, Herman, will drop a link in the chat to sign up for membership if you haven't already. Would definitely encourage you to do so. Speaking of the chat, feel free to use it. Talk with other people in the event. I will just encourage you and remind you that we use a code of conduct at our events. It's available on our website. Essentially what it says is, be nice. These are safe spaces for learning. Be respectful of other people's opinions and your fellow attendees. So please do that. And then finally, we will do Q&A at the end of our discussion. So if you have questions or things you want us to address, our panelists to address, please make sure to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I know all of us are pretty Zoom proficient at this point, but if you put it in the chat, our director of content, Marianne Wellington, who will get on for Q&A, might miss it. So please make sure to put it in the Q&A section. So our panelists, I'm so excited. I want to introduce you to our two fabulous guests today. So Chewy Shaw is a software engineer at Google with a degree from MIT, working on keeping the technical infrastructure reliable, which thank you, Chewy. I benefit from you every day. Chewy was recently elected to be the executive vice chair of the newly formed Alphabet Workers Union at Google. And Chewy is a multiple, accepts any pronouns, and focuses on using his neurodiversity to ensure that everyone gets a chance to be heard, no matter what their perspective is, which love. Thank you, Chewy. Love that. Love that you're here today. And we're also joined by Dr. Chris Benner. Dr. Chris Benner is a professor, chair, and director of the Everett program and the Santa Cruz Institute for Social Transformation at UC Santa Cruz. His research examines the relationships between technological change, regional development, and the structure of economic opportunity. And he focuses on regional labor markets and the transformation of work and employment. So like right in our wheelhouse. Thank you for being here, Dr. Benner. He's also a prolific author. He's written a lot of books, dozens of journal articles, and more. So we're just so honored to have you both here with us today. I'm excited for our conversation. And I wanted to get us started with just a little bit of context before we jump into kind of questions and discussion. I know when we talk about unions, for a lot of folks who may be unfamiliar, it kind of evokes this image of, you know, a sit-down strike in a factory floor in the 1940s and black and white photos. But I will just say, as someone who is coming to Tech Equity from, you know, a decade plus inside the labor movement, unions are really relevant for workers today. They're not just a relic of the past. And I think, you know, there's lots of different models, lots of different statistics, lots of information on sort of the role that unions play in our economy. But just to kind of set us with some context, I thought it might be helpful to share, you know, especially in this moment of a pandemic where nearly 500,000 people have died in this country, you know, 94% of union members have access to healthcare compared to 33% of non-union workers, right? So there are some real tangible benefits around having a union for workers. And there are lots of stats like that in terms of wages, paid leave, economic wealth, all sorts of things. And I think, you know, in particular here at Tech Equity, we are laser focused on building an equitable economy for everyone. And one of the proven pathways to reduce income inequality in the US is to increase worker power. And one of the clearest ways that that happens is through strong, robust unions. So that said, my card's on the table. I know that many of you may not share those beliefs about unions, or have questions or concerns, or wonder how does a union work, maybe things you've heard, beliefs you hold. So whatever it is, I invite you to put those questions in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get to those as we get into the question and answer period of the discussion. For today, though, I'm going to kind of bring us down from the big picture utility of union question into the role that unions are playing in tech. And in particular, we're going to, obviously with Chewy on, and focus on some of the emergent union organizing inside tech. I know that there is really incredible organizing that's taken place for many, many years of contracted workers, service workers, low wage workers. So shout out to our brothers and sisters at SEIU, USWW, Unite Here, who have been doing fabulous work getting those folks organized and getting their wages and benefits improved. There's been a lot of work and writing and events done on that. So for today, we're focused more on the new sort of side that we're seeing coming out, right? With Alphabet Workers Unions, Kickstarter, Hearst, all sorts of those projects that are emerging. So just wanted to add that as context for people. And I know that, given that context, many people see the value of unions for low wage workers. They understand it. And one of the things that's been coming up a lot is folks are just confused about why, higher wage earners, or folks that are perceived to have a lot of power in the labor market, a lot of options, would want to form a union. And I think that that sort of confusion is a great place for us to start. And I'm actually going to start and kick over to Chewy. And I wonder if you could just talk to us about, why did you and your coworkers at Google decide to form a union?
Yeah, no, and thanks for giving that context. Because I definitely think a large part of it does come from just these associations that have gotten set into society in the ways that we talk about unions, going back from the 1930s. For us, well, particularly for me and for several of the others who were in the early, we didn't come at this from a perspective of thinking that we needed to, justify why a union needed to be here. And, we're like, unions are great, let's figure out how to get one here. It more was from first principles. We started off with, many of us came and joined this company because of the values of the company. We love the concepts that they gave out about what drives the company, how decisions are made, how there's a dedication to not being evil, where that translated when I first joined into, if anybody brings up a concern that looks like we are ignoring the needs of some group of people, it gets taken seriously. And, we make sure that we create time for it. We make sure that we are at least attempting to respond to it and choose options based off of that. Over time, we saw that shift, and we saw it become more focused on executives trying to keep the PR image good. And so it became more and more focused on just silencing the problem. And that included then getting rid of the person who is raising the issue. And we started seeing more and more people forced out of the company. And so from looking at the situation, we felt like what we needed was some way for us to be able to support each other. We felt that there were a number of us who, not being those activists who've spoken out in these ways, still felt like those activists led us. And a large part of why we felt like we were able to be on a good path was because we knew there was somebody who was going to speak out if something was wrong, and that we could work together around that. And so as we started seeing that those individuals were directly getting forced out for speaking up, it started making us question what types of structures, what are the ways that we as co-workers can add any sort of support. And what we came to is a union. There are a number of different ways of thinking about like what does the word union mean, but like at its core, it's really just workers using their collective power to try to control the way their business is operated. And unions go back before the 1930s. There were many attempts to get workers to work together and start strategizing together, start figuring out how can we use the fact that this operation needs us to then make sure that it follows what we all agree should be the right path forward, whether that's in terms of taking care of our coworkers or making sure we're not abusing the environment around us, and making sure that, you know, the ways that we impact the world is in the right way. And so out of that same type of a desire of us to really make sure that our company, which we feel like we are putting meaningful effort into and has a massive impact on people all around the world, we see a need to make sure that it is actually following the values that it has set, that we've all agreed to, and that we don't see any structure doing that right now, but we believe a union could. And so we are not necessarily structuring it in the same way other unions have been structured and how they think about like going after different campaigns, but we're still a union because we're still a group of people getting together to use our worker power to influence how these decisions are made.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chewy. I think that's really helpful. And I actually think it might be helpful, Dr. Benner, if you could talk about sort of how the AWU model fits into the broader union model landscape and sort of what this is looking like across the board.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. And first, just thanks for having us here. And Chewy, it's a real pleasure to meet you and learn about the work that you're doing, because I've seen it from a distance and been really inspired and really appreciate learning a bit more. So I want to make a distinction between sort of worker self-organization and the legal structure and representation, because Chewy made reference to the 1930s. And you know what happened in the 1930s is we got the National Labor Relations Act, which codified into law a very narrow understanding of what a union is, right? And it allows for representation within a single workplace. And that's very different than other advanced democracies, where there'll be systems to either mandate or encourage representation at least a company-wide level, and in most places actually an industry-wide level. So there'll be mandated bargaining across an entire industry. And we don't have many examples of that in the US. It does exist in the building trades to a certain extent, and the movie, television, sort of entertainment industry to a certain extent. But by and large, we have decentralized representation to single work sites, in a way that then, okay, you can get a collective bargaining agreement that's enforceable by law if you can get a majority of people in that workplace to vote in favor of union representation under an election that's supervised by the National Labor Relations Board. But that's only one model of a union, right? Or what I should say, one model of worker self-organization, the collective power that Chewy referred to. And I want to talk about three other ones that I think are really important. So one is this notion of minority unionism, right? And you know, any workplace can have people who come together and join membership in a union or other organization to try and represent themselves in the workplace. And those existed quite frequently prior to the National Labor Relations Act, prior to the 1930s. Since then, they've largely gone out, but I think, you know, the Alphabet Workers Union is one example trying to get to that relationship with Google. The other prominent example in the US is the United Auto Workers, Local 42, in the Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And this was a case where the union lost an election, but Volkswagen voluntarily agreed to have the union represent the worker members, and creating really a German-style works council, it's sort of a workplace-based representation body. So it is possible, there's precedent for that, and the Alphabet Workers Union could get to that point of negotiating an agreement with Google if Google is willing to do that. But a second point that is really important, or form of worker organizing, is guilds. You know, guilds have been used for, you know, centuries as a way of workers trying to come together and use the leverage of their skills and knowledge and experience collectively to improve working conditions for themselves. And this can be most effective when that power then gets codified in law. So you can really think about, doctors, lawyers, even engineers and others, where you have to get some kind of legally empowered certification. These are really just a form of union. It's coming out of guilds where workers have come together and said, we should have that power. And, for many of us as customers, it's a good thing, because not just anyone can put up a plaque and be a doctor. But there's an element of that, of saying, this is what counts as medicine. And so all the people who are practicing, holistic medicine or other kinds of, non-Western medicine, don't get the same rewards in the labor market because they haven't organized collectively in the same way that doctors or lawyers have. And then the final third piece is really what I think of as social movement unionism or community unionism, where the leverage point is public opinion and politics, right? Where you're organizing, you're trying to raise a set of issues, and the broader sort of public support becomes an important part of your leverage. And I do think there are elements of the Alphabet Workers Union that reflect that as well, raising issues about what is the role of Google in our society, and what is the role of race and gender and discrimination and algorithms, and how do those shape inequality in our society. And you mentioned some of the organizing in the janitors and security guards, and that social movement unionism was a really important part of getting the union contract, because it was justice for janitors and broad popular support for that movement as well. So I think it's really important when we talk about unions to recognize the union definition in law is very, very narrow, and there are many different forms of worker self-organizing and collective organizing that exist in our society and are very important.
Absolutely. I remember a friend of mine went and started kind of a digital organizing framework, and when she was studying labor law. She had been an organizer and was like, it's amazing that we've organized a single worker in this country, because it is so onerous to get people into a union and get them like the legal protection of this. It's amazing. So the more you know, the more you're like, wow, this is very narrow. So thank you. I think that that kind of overview is helpful, because I know when the reporting was coming out about you all, Chewy, a lot of stress in the reporting was like minority union. And so we had folks saying like, well, what does that mean? Right. And so I think your framework of like, these are all just vehicles for collective worker voice, right? And collective worker organizing is right. Given that, I think, one of the natural follow-on questions is that obviously these efforts in terms of what people would recognize as a union in some shape or form are limited inside of tech, right? We're seeing Kickstarter, I think, was one of the first in terms of the traditional sort of office setting tech worker. Hearst, digital media, a little bit different, but, formed through the Writers Guild. And then I know there's other ones that are kind of popping right now. And then obviously the big splash with Alphabet Workers unionizing. And so I wonder if you both could just talk about what you see as sort of the biggest barriers for tech workers in organizing. What do you think is keeping that number small? Is it folks' appetite for it? Is it structural? Is it company behavior? Is it all of it? And if there's any sort of signs of hope that you see?
Yeah, just to start off with, I think going off of what Chris brought up of guilds is a really good part of this, because it's part of how young this industry is. A lot of other industries have been around for so long that they've gone through so many different changes in structure and society that they ended up like being part of kind of the structuring and decision making of how we think about work as the legal protections and different things like that. This industry really got it started in the 80s. And during this period of time, it's been more focused on, hey, if you're excited about this, come join, rather than about, let's set meaningful standards about how this should be run. And, we've now gotten a lot of people excited because now there's a lot of money in it. But at the same time, we're also now affecting a large part of the world with each of the decisions that are made. And I feel like there's kind of an element now where this is part of also how there was a recognition within the more theoretical scientific community that there needed to be more protection after the Manhattan Project happened, because there are ways that by how companies organize themselves, or these different structures that hire these intellectuals in to help out, they can make it so they hide from you what the actual impact of the work you're doing is going to be. They hide from you how your coworkers are being treated. They hide as much as they can to try to make it feel like, everything's fine, until all of a sudden, years later, you find out that you were complicit in something that caused millions of people's lives to be destroyed. And when we have situations like that starting to happen, when we start seeing across the board these really big impacts of these decisions are being made by a handful of executives at the top, it starts to then re-clarify to a lot of people. Now we start to see, yes, this is actually another situation where we need meaningful input in how these decisions are made. We can't just let whoever's excited most and can make it work decide what happens. We have to actually be responsible in how we make our decisions.
One of the things I really appreciate about sort of putting it in that historical perspective, Chewy, is, Samantha, you started talking about the barriers to organizing in the industry. And actually, if we sort of take off the lens of the formal union, organizing is going on in the industry for decades, often in this guild structure. I had actually a 2003 paper called Next Generation Unionism in the Information Revolution, which was all about guilds that existed. The System Administrators Guild, the Silicon Valley Web Guild, the HTML Writers Guild, Graphic Artists Guild, even things like the Society for Technical Communication, all were performing a similar function, right? Where people were trying to come together and, in a context of rapid changing technology and skill needs, it's really hard to get the power of lawyers or doctors of really codifying those skills. And so what gave people power in their workplace and in the labor market was constantly being at the cutting edge of new skill development, which they got by organizing together, right? And understanding what are the new trends and helps, and lots of examples of communication across workplaces where someone might have a challenge in the work that they were trying to do, but have relationships with other people in their occupation and other workplaces that allowed them to do the work better, and also giving each other advice about negotiating their own individual contracts. But I think what's happened subsequent to then, one is some of those more formal organizations, they were still pretty informal in the 90s and 2000s, have now actually migrated to meetups, right? And we did a study in 2016 that found, over 220 meetups, of workers in the tech industry in different occupations coming together. It had over 300,000 members and, hosting close to 20 meetings a year on average. And again, it's this thing about learning new skills, improving their condition in the labor market. But what hasn't happened through that form is actually trying to put leverage on employers to do something different. And I think what we're seeing now in the most recent period is the power of the tech firms. They've always been very powerful, but their levels of monopoly in their key sectors, the level of wealth accumulations that their role in society at large has gotten to a point where the kind of organizing we're seeing and the general sort of popular concern about the role they're playing in society has gotten to a point where we're seeing more of these efforts coming to try and hold them accountable for both, the contract workers and their existing employees and others, but also about their broader role in society at large.
Yeah, it's making me think so many things as you two are going through this, sort of like zooming out and looking at this from a historical lens, the role of guilds. The thing that's coming up for me was another, controversial Google move with the firing of Dr. Gebru, the influential AI scientist, and who was raising the alarm bell, as I know many workers inside of tech companies have done around these new technologies. And so it's just sort of making me think about the role of a guild in a professionalized sort of standard setting, how those overlap with tech is, I think, a really interesting way to come at this of it's not just about worker organizing, it's how do workers have the space and the sort of credentialed ability to raise that alarm bell. Because I know for me as an organizer for many years, it honestly has often been confusing to me why employers fight so hard. Because I'm this is such a benefit to you, right? You have folks who care about the future of the organization, the company, the the county, whatever it might be. And so I was always just sort of dumbfounded that like, if I were in charge, I would want to channel some of that and bring in that knowledge and expertise. I would see that as a really big benefit. So I find that very fascinating to sort of approach it from that lens. One thing I wanted to, make sure to talk about is obviously, I think folks know that in Alabama, there is an organizing drive for what I think, given this conversation would be considered a more traditional union, but Amazon warehouse workers, about 5,800 of them are voting this month by mail on whether or not they will have a union. So it has definitely been tried before inside Amazon warehouses. There is an incredible organizing effort that has taken place with, a multitude of different groups and unions trying to come together to make this happen for, Amazon, which is on track to be the largest employer in the world. And, I think it has major implications for what happens inside of companies moving forward. But I'm just curious, Chewy or, Dr. Benner, if you have thoughts about, for tech workers that maybe aren't inside a factory or aren't a gig worker doing delivery, or, some of those more what we would perceive as like traditional union routes, how can they show up and be supportive to those efforts if it's something that they think is beneficial? What are you seeing as opportunities for other workers to be in solidarity with those efforts?
So we're actually already trying to kind of bridge that gap. Like that's the gap between contract workers and white collar workers we see as part of, the long tradition of employers trying to dip around labor law in order to take away the need to give benefits to certain people. So similar to how outsourcing has been a way to kind of get out of the legal structure of one country, go find one that has much more lax laws and work with that. Contract work, if you can find a way to argue and get some judge to agree with you that this should be contract work, then now you can just keep a rotation where as long as nobody works in the same role for more than 2 years at a time, you don't have to give them benefits. And so they are literally right now just rotating people out. They work for 2 years. They say you cannot work here for the next 6 months. Those people have to go find something else to do for 6 months, and then they come back and start working again, just to get outside of the restrictions of the labor law. And so we see this as being the way that the employers are continually trying to remove, shift as many roles as possible to a state where they don't have to be responsible for these people and for their livelihood. And so we see it as really important for us kind of to make sure that we are using the fact that we are still ones that the employer has not yet decided are expendable, and use that to speak up for the ones who the employer has decided. And to that point, I'm putting it into the chat right now. We've actually filed an unfair labor practices charge against one of the contract companies that's working with Google about one of the workers in a data center where she was getting, as far as we can tell, they were trying to quietly fire her. They would not say directly whether she still had a job there or not. And were then dealing with, like, they were just trying to ghost her out because she had posted a Facebook post to her friends saying how she could not get a water bottle replaced. And pointing out that if they won't even replace her water bottle, why should any of them believe they're actually going to care about the hazard pay that the group of them have been begging for? And so they got upset about that and were trying to then silence her and kick her out. We see that as being just as important, just as much of speaking up about issues as Dr. Timnit Gebru, talking about the worldwide implications of these different technologies. Like, either we're hurting the communities of the places where we put our data centers by, making all of this then a bunch of workers who are completely stressed out all the time, barely trying to survive, or we are creating technology that then is causing our technology to then ignore communities. In both cases, it's hurting the communities of our world, and we want to stand up for that as well. And I think, like, using the fact that it is harder to just fire a bunch of us than it is to just get rid of an entire vendor. You know, Google can say, we're not using Adecco anymore, so we're just going to get rid of all the Adecco workers because there's too many complaints from them. And the fact that they can't easily do that with us then gives us the opportunity to leverage their voices up.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I wanted to lift up a couple of things, both from your question and Chewy's comments, which is, about, we hear about this effort to organize, this one Amazon facility, and it gets a lot of, attention, and it'll be very interesting to see what's happening there. But that's just the tip of the iceberg of the organizing that has been going on in a variety of different ways around Amazon in particular, but, also around the tech industry more generally. And, the unfair labor practice charge that Chewy pointed to, is just another example of thinking about what are all the different leverage points that workers can gain access to help address the concerns that, workers have, as well as we might have in the broader society about the practices of these firms. And so, with Amazon, people are trying to build workplace-based organizing in fulfillment centers all around the country. But there's also efforts, for instance, to try and publicize how is it that Jeff Bezos could add, what is the figure today, $100 billion to his wealth in the midst of a pandemic while we have, immense unemployment. And so groups like, the patriotic millionaires, right, are trying to advocate for, we need a wealth tax. Yeah. Because this is unfair in the way that Bezos and Amazon is profiting off of the pandemic and the need for so many people to be essential workers while others are being at home. So just to point to that, and partially then is also thinking about with the new administration in power, is that there are some opportunities for changing federal labor law. And so even as we're trying to file unfair labor practices in cases where we have access, how can we push federally for stronger support for sectoral bargaining, for easing the workplace-based organizing? I think there's a lot of things that can be done, but it requires that organizing at the base, or, with workers and their allies to make that possible.
Yeah, I think there's so much kind of happening at once, I think, connected to what you had said, Chewy, about like, if you zoom out, this is an industry that really started in the 80s. And I think the modern day manifestation of it is like the last 15 years, right? We've seen this sort of like massive shift in how tech impacts democracy and communication and all of that. And I think, one of the things that's interesting to me is that, we're seeing lots of company management, company leadership have trepidation about these efforts, right? About the combining, push for regulation to the sort of impacts of their products and racial disparities to worker organizing. And I think for that reason, we're also hearing a lot of sort of dissuading workers from touching it, right? And so I'm just kind of curious, Chewy, what are you talking to other workers as the benefits of joining AWU? Like, what do those conversations look like? Obviously there's a moral call that you're making, right? But what does it look like when you're really talking that through with folks?
Well, there are a number of different directions it goes. Now, like our 101 for organizing is really that you need to start from where the person that you're talking to is concerned, and talk about the things that they care about. Because like that's really what's going to drive them. They're not going to join a union because they know how much you care about this.
Right.
They're going to join if you touch on something that they care about. So we always try to start off by understanding, what are you upset about right now? What would you like to get better in how our company is being run? And so there's kind of a wide range, but like, generally we have been seeing, like, early days we tried to categorize, and this was kind of one of the good exercises that we did in terms of just trying to think of what are the central things that we really want to focus on and stand for. We had a group of us get together and just list, if I were in charge of the company right now and could do like absolutely anything, what would be the 3 things that I would most want to have changed about the company right now? And then just like going through the list of what people came up with, then trying to categorize them, try to understand what are then the connection points behind what's driving each of us to say that change needs to happen. And so from that, we found that there are some concerns with like how this system is really trying to make some workers disappear. and just like make it so that we don't notice them, we don't think about them as being people. They're directly trying to get us to give the association of like they are outsiders. They cannot be trusted. By default, do not trust any contract workers. Their badges are a different color. They are the bad guys. And framing it that way then keeps us separate. And so like there's a bunch of people who are really upset as they've been getting to know people on the other side of that and finding out these aren't bad guys. These are people who care just as much about our mission as we do and are just being limited because a company can get away with it. And so there's a number of people where in that case, what we're talking about is how can we really uplift their voices, because they don't even have anyone to complain to. In these cases, they end up having it where if they try to raise a complaint, the vendor company says, first of all, you're never allowed to ask any Alphabet employees, any full-time employees for help. You know, that's just completely out of the rules. If we find out that you went asking for help, we're going to get rid of you because you are causing them too much stress. Then second, if they try to ask the vendor for help, the vendor says, oh, that's a decision that Alphabet made. We can't do anything about that. If they go and try to escalating up the Alphabet management change, they get told, oh, well, actually the vendor is your boss, so whatever they say rules, and they have no one that they can complain to. So what we're just trying to create for that situation is let's be a place where if you have a complaint, we will make sure it gets heard. And, you know, that's the first step that we can do. Uplift these voices that are getting silenced. On the front of people who really care about some of the different ways that our products are affecting the world, we're noticing like how the people who've been speaking up, like Dr. Timothy Gebru, brought up some really useful research using data to bring up a conversation about how do we use our technology more responsibly. She was trying to make our technology more responsible for the world, and she got punished for that. Mm-hmm. What we think we can do now with just the leverage that we have at this point, like we want to get to a point where we can do as many different forms of power as we can. But at this point, what we do see that we can do is every time that somebody gets forced out from the company for bringing up an issue, we keep bringing up that issue. We make sure that that act of them doing that actually makes the issue get louder. Every time they try to push somebody out, that becomes something that then drives us to make this a battle cry. And so then we disincentivize them to silence people that way. And we can at the very least start changing the incentive structure. And over time, then we can also really start then making it more possible for these concerns then to actually start getting addressed more directly. But the first thing is making sure that these concerns are being discussed. And so we see kind of ways that just like by us using our voice, by us being willing to stand up and talk to our coworkers, say, hey, this project doesn't seem right. I don't think we should be working on that. And getting people to start slowing down the process with these questions, you know, we can materially affect how this works.
Absolutely. That's really interesting.
Can I build on one thing there that I think is really important is that, you know, Dr. Gebru's case of being pushed out, you know, as an academic, you know, I was one of more than 4,000 people that signed on to a letter expressing concern about what happened. And it's a case where the internal management practices have a potential impact on the world in the way that Chewy described it, wanting, you know, responsible algorithms and technology. And, you know, it becomes a possibility where there's external leverage as well if those practices are made public, right? So it's a way of saying, you know, that the supposed private relationship between employer and employee actually has public implications as well. And I think that's part of the problem with our narrow legal definition of what should be a union, right? Because in fact, when you have a good relationship between workers and managers in a workplace, it actually has social benefits, right? When there's less workplace conflict, it leads to greater productivity. You know, there's all sorts of examples where greater equity leads to greater economic growth. You know, this shouldn't be defined as just this narrow thing only. It also has these broader public implications. And so the public work that's going on in some of the Alphabet Workers Union of sharing these practices with the broader world is really important. And I think Google management cares because they want really smart people working at Google. attract
Yeah.
the best and brightest from the universities. And if those of us in the universities are saying, hey, whoa, what are you doing in there? I hope that has some leverage on them.
Absolutely. And just a plug for folks on the call that are like, what can I do? Maybe I don't have a union I can join right now. There's Dr. Benner alluded to it. There's a lot of legislation that is a potential federally, but also in the state that's sort of trying to chip at opening this up somewhat. And we're going to have an event later this month, I believe on the 25th, for our members to walk them through sort of what we're looking at for a legislative agenda. And so would invite any of you to join. It'll be a space for members to really dig into what those pieces of legislation look like, ask questions, give feedback, because we're trying to make sure that people have a place to take action, not just within their workplaces, but what we do is really outside of the workplace, right? Getting them active on a policy agenda. So want to invite folks to be a part of that. And with that, I'd like to open it up for Q&A and invite our Director of Content, Marianne Wellington, to come on and see what kind of questions we have for our guests.
There we go. There's the unmute button. You'd think after a year doing this, I'd have it better, but here we are. Thank you all so much for this conversation, Chris and Shui. This has been a really amazing conversation to be a part of. We have some questions in the chat. I wanted to start with just stepping back for a 101 on the distinctions between guilds, unions, and professional associations. So maybe Chris, you want to go take that one?
Yeah, so there's no hard and fast, line between them, but, guilds have a long history of trying to have workers self-organizing around an occupation. So they're occupationally based associations, not company or worksite based associations. And typically have not necessarily had licensing or, protection from government in any way. They have evolved. I would say professional associations are kind of a modern version of a guild. And, some professional associations then have certification programs that are recognized by government law. Others, just have internal certifications, and it depends on, often on the level of public consequences of someone practicing that profession unethically or without the skills that they profess to have. So, it is important to recognize that, I made the comment earlier, and there was a question coming in about, we have doctors who, emerged out of the American Medical Association and other professional associations and have created a system of licensing doctors that is really important for making sure people who practice medicine are doing it well. But what we haven't done is then tried to figure out how to systematize and recognize the knowledge in, non-Western health practices, right? Western medicine is very good at treating illness. It's not so good at promoting health. And there are other traditions out there that are very well good at promoting health, but we don't have those systems in place for recognizing that. And professional associations could play a very important role that would both protect people doing that work as well as society. And then unions are, a legally recognized category of worker association in this country. And they have the power to represent workers in a workplace in a legally protected collective bargaining agreement with employers. But it is a particular category of legal entity in the US, like a nonprofit 501c3 organization. It's a particular category.
And go ahead, Chewy, sorry.
Just to add on to that, that's part of the reason that we chose the word union in that case with that landscape is because union we still see as kind of being focused on one company. Like we wanted to make sure that our focus, like as we were thinking about our scope, we wanted to make sure we covered all types of work, but within one company. And so oftentimes guilds and professional associations are about one type of work, but then across multiple companies. And we felt union fit a bit better for our attempts to make sure that every voice within Alphabet was heard.
The only thing I was going to add, just to give people a sense of scale, when Chris is talking about the legal framework for, what we understand as a union, just the steps to form an NLRB certified union, you have to get 30% of the workers in that company to sign a physical authorization card saying, I want a union. So if you take Google, for example, I think you're at like 140,000 employees, right? So 30% signing a physical card within a time limit is a pretty big constraint, right, in our current legal framework. And then on top of it, you have an election, right, where 50% of the voting employees have to say, yes, I want a union and I want this one. So I think that's also just important for people to understand that that's a, you know, when we're talking about companies, you know, Amazon has nearly 800,000 employees. That was before the pandemic, right? So when we're talking about companies at scale, these models are really, really difficult for workers to pull off, right? And so that's the utility of these different models that Chewy and his colleagues have figured out. And, you know, what Dr. Benner's talking about with guilds, that's a really important part of the conversation, I would just add.
And also with that, so we have about 130,000 full-time employees, but we have about 270,000 total employees. And the way labor law is set up right now, the way a lot of experts are looking at it, they see it that to get to those agreements, we might have to then separate out full-time employees as one unit, each of the different groups of the different contract workers as different units, which then makes it so much harder, as then like it forces us to split up. And so that's part of why like that structure, it's so limiting, because it is based off of just one concept of how can people come together, and does not recognize that, you know, we may have some concerns that we want to cross those barriers and raise together.
Yeah, and we could talk for a long time about the barriers to formal unionization, because you mentioned it, you know, it's within a company, and it's actually within a legally defined or approved by the NLRB collective bargaining unit of a group of workers that have a similar community of interest. And of course, lawyers will contest what's the appropriate bargaining unit. So even if you try and certify to get an election, you know, it's got to be certified by the NLRB before you can actually hold the election. So it becomes another place where companies can put in a barrier to organizing and, you know, intimidate workers from continuing that work. So huge barriers. And anyone who gets to that point of a collective bargaining agreement in this country is a complete hero in my book, because it's so hard to get there and so courageous.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is such a fun conversation. We have a question, I think, for Chewy about a little bit of insight on the dynamics of Google executives' stance on the formation of AWU. And have there been any? I know it's really early, so caveats. But has there been any successful systemic change that the union has seen thus far? Have you seen any bias and caution with the people that they report to in their actual day-to-day work?
So at this stage, what we're seeing is it seems that the executives are trying to hope us away. You know, hope that like enough time, they just don't have to really discuss us, and then we'll implode on our own and they don't have to worry about us. So then we take that from like, they haven't really, like they had one quick statement for the New York Times article saying that they support workers and try to listen directly to the workers. And since then, they've not said anything about us or any of our statements. They, as far as I'm told, first we're telling managers to treat us like an ERG, an employee resource group, and to that not, you know, treat it as any more serious than that. More recently, I'm hearing people say that their managers are being told to ignore the union in any ways that they are evaluating us, and to make sure that they just do not consider it positively or negatively, which is upsetting some members because they want to record how much work they're doing trying to help the community, and we are supposed to be recording our community contributions. But, you know, at the same time, it seems that they are coming from a stance right now of trying to wait us out. So that's also then kind of where we're now coming from, a point then where we feel more comfortable just coming in with the strength. And so we first, you know, spoke out about our concerns of how there was a misuse of policy with YouTube, that if, you know, we at least had reliably followed rules, we might not have an insurrection at the Capitol. But, you know, like at the same time, we don't think the rules that are in place are the best rules either. We feel like there's a lot of improvements that need to be done. But in general, we want to be part of those discussions. We're still waiting for them to find a way to include us in those discussions. Right now, we don't really have a way to have a say in how the structures of YouTube are set up. And then similarly, we then recently released this support around this one data center worker to try to then demonstrate both from our perspective, this is an important issue to us and we want to protect her. She has, since we released that EOP, she's now been brought back onto the job. And so we have helped her specifically materially, and we want to continue this. We want to make sure that like they stop giving hazard pay during the pandemic. They started at the beginning and then they went, you know what? We just gave for a certain few months and now we're not going to extend that. And we want them to start really paying attention to these people's needs. At the very least, they should be doing that. We're talking with a bunch of the workers to figure out what are the right ways that we can really make our voices heard. And if the company is scared of offending us, then we're just going to be loud and we're just going to speak up about what we think needs to change.
Wonderful, thank you. You know, Chewy, you mentioned that y'all's choice to form a union was really intentional about wanting to keep it to the company. And I was wondering, and some folks in the chat were also wondering about the potential of guilds or, you know, industry-wide organizing of workers within the tech industry. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, both of you, all of you, about just like the temperature, what could potentially happen in the future, and then what type of labor law changes would be necessary in order to make that possible.
Chris, do you want to go? I don't know the changes in labor law question.
Yeah, I was going to let Chewy go first about organizing across the industry as more of an inside.
Yeah. So, so there are a couple of things that I think, like, so I feel like across the industry, there are just a number of these concerns that a lot of people have that are all shared within these different areas that I think just go to the heart of, is your company following the values that you signed up for? And I think like, there's a lot that the fact that we are at a big company means people are paying attention to us. It's part of why we have power right now. If we didn't have the attention to be able to get a New York Times piece, we may not be in the same situation right now with them trying to avoid us. And so we see that and recognize that it's not as easy for a lot of other companies. So we definitely want to support others as much as we can. One of the ways that some former Googlers that started to try to do that is they started working with a company Coworker. And so we have actually a fund, Coworker Fund, where the goal is for us to be able to help support workers, activists all throughout the tech industry who are doing organizing or activism work and help them to really be able to move forward with that. At this point, you know, we're seeing the best ways that we can support doing a $2,500 stipend. At this point, 19 people have been given a stipend from a variety of different types of roles, from different companies. Some are, you know, data center workers, some rideshare workers, some of the Amazon warehouse workers, some people from Google. So that's a great place that people can help give money if they want to help fund the stipends to then help support the work these people are doing. Alternatively, if people are doing work and they, you know, want to get support, that's one of the places where we're looking to, you know, on the one hand, start giving some meaningful support, some material support. And on the other hand, also help out with starting to bridge these gaps, starting to connect people together. You know, as we start getting to know people through this process, we can then start creating tools and processes. And Coworker, as a company, they've been really focused on doing all they can to help and bridge a lot of these gaps. And so we're really excited to continue working with them in that way.
I'll just add sort of a couple of things. You know, one is recognizing that, you know, there has been work going on in the industry as a whole for a couple of decades, focused more on the sort of lower wage, lower end of the industry. And, you know, we mentioned earlier the janitors and security guards, but, you know, I'll just give a shout out to the South Bay Central Labor Council and working partnerships, because part of that work has also been focused on raising the minimum wage, and earlier on trying to get universal health insurance for, kids in Santa Clara County, and addressing affordable housing, and trying to hold Google accountable for their development plans around the Diridon, transport hub. That, there's a lot of work going on trying to hold the tech industry accountable to the local community. And so just to say, it has been going on, and it's gaining some strength now and visibility at, I think, more highly paid sectors of the tech industry, which I'm excited about. In terms of the labor law legislation, in Washington, like, who knows in the current administration, razor thin majority in the Senate doesn't give me a lot of hope. But, we've got some progressive people in the Department of Labor, including the Deputy Director, Julie Su, hopefully, if she gets approved. And I think there's a lot that can be done sort of internally that could be really helpful. And I do think there's a lot of concern about Prop 22 and the ways that just really, opened up in California abuse of independent contractors. And it's not just, the Uber and Lyft, but, in a whole variety of different industries and occupations. So I do think there's increasing concern about that in Washington, and something might be done about that.
Yep. Well, we are at just over one. So I want to thank Chewy and Dr. Benner for being a part of this discussion today. I thought it was really interesting and just so helpful and just fascinating to hear what's going on inside of Alphabet Workers Union, and to be able to put that in context with the sort of history of what's been happening here. So thank you to you both. And just a reminder to folks on the call, if you are interested in this work, want to do more with us, please become a member. The link is in the chat. And also, given Chris's last point, we did an event in January on what a Biden administration might mean for labor. So would encourage you to go check that out. You can learn more about these pieces of legislation and gig workers and all of that fun stuff. And thank you everyone for being a part of it. And we hope to see you at an event again soon. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.